The sun hung low over the pristine suburban neighborhood, casting a golden glow over neatly manicured lawns and identical beige houses, each with its own carefully curated landscaping. It was the kind of place where the biggest disruptions were barking dogs or kids riding their bikes too close to someone's driveway. Exactly the kind of neighborhood where HOA ruled with an iron fist. Jake Carter had lived here long enough to know the rules. No unapproved paint colors, no yard decorations that deviated from the aesthetic, and certainly no vehicles that stood out too much. But he never cared much for HOA's micromanaging, and he certainly didn't think his latest purchase would be a problem. His Dodge Challenger Hellcat, a deep, fiery red with black racing stripes slicing through its sleek frame, sat proudly in his garage, waiting for the weekend when he could finally take it for a proper spin. It was his dream car, something he had worked tirelessly for, saving every spare penny for years. The deep growl of its supercharged V8 engine was music to his ears, a symbol of his hard-earned success. But it wasn't long before his dream turned into a source of contention. The letter arrived just 3 days after he parked the car in his driveway for the first time. A crisp white envelope with the HOA's official emblem was taped to his front door, as if it were some kind of court summons. The message inside was even more infuriating. Dear Mr. Carter, it has come to our attention that your vehicle, a red Dodge Challenger, violates the aesthetic standards outlined in the HOA community guidelines. The vehicle is excessively loud, disruptive, and does not align with the established visual harmony of the neighborhood. As such, you are required to remove the vehicle from your property within 72 hours or face further action. Failure to comply will result in appropriate enforcement measures. Sincerely, Richard Wallace, HOA President. Jake read the letter twice, his grip tightening with every word. Excessively loud? He hadn't even revved the engine past idle in the neighborhood. Disruptive? The car had been parked in his own garage since the moment he brought it home. And visual harmony? That was just HOA's pretentious way of saying they didn't like anything that wasn't bland and forgettable. Unbelievable, he muttered, crumpling the letter in his fist. He stormed inside, slamming the front door behind him, and tossed the letter onto the kitchen table where his grandmother, Edna Carter, sat with a steaming cup of black coffee. She barely flinched at the noise. Years of military service had conditioned her to ignore unnecessary outbursts. With silver hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp green eyes that could cut through a man's soul, she was a woman who had seen more battles than any HOA board could ever dream of. "What's got your britches in a twist, boy?" she asked without looking up, stirring her coffee methodically. Jake let out an exasperated sigh, grabbing the letter and handing it to her. She read it in silence, her expression unreadable, before setting it down and taking another sip of coffee. "Well, that's some great-a horseshit," she finally said, smirking. Jake huffed. "Yeah, tell me about it. I mean, it's my car, my property. How the hell do they think they can tell me what to do with it?" Edna leaned back in her chair, lacing her fingers together. "HOA folks think they own the damn world. Back in my day, people minded their own business. But now, these neighborhood Nazis want control over every little thing, what color your door can be, how short your grass needs to be, and now, apparently, what kind of car you can drive. Buncha morons with too much time on their hands." Jake exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "I should just ignore them. They can't actually do anything, right?" Edna raised an eyebrow. "Oh, they can try. Question is, are you gonna let them?" Jake wasn't sure. He had no intention of moving his car, and he sure as hell wasn't going to be bullied into submission by some uptight HOA president who thought he was king of the cul-de-sac. But something told him that Richard Wallace wouldn't back down so easily. The next day, the passive-aggressive warnings escalated. Another letter, then a second one, then a third, now stamped with a big red final notice across the top. Richard Wallace himself even stopped by once, dressed in his usual khakis and polo shirt, his arms crossed as he stared at the car like it was some kind of crime scene. "You really should reconsider," Richard had said, his voice laced with that condescending tone HOA presidents always seem to have. "We have policies in place for a reason. It's about the community, maintaining a certain standard." Jake had smiled, arms folded across his chest. Funny. I thought the community meant people getting along and minding their own damn business. Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He simply exhaled through his nose and shook his head. If you don't move it, we'll have no choice but to take further action. Jake had laughed at the time. Good luck with that, he had said before shutting the door in Richard's face. But now, standing in his garage and staring at his challenger, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. HOA had power. They had influence. And he knew Richard Wallace wasn't the type to let things go. Still, he refused to be intimidated. He would stand his ground no matter what petty tricks they pulled. What he didn't know was that Richard Wallace wasn't going to settle for warnings. He had already made up his mind. If Jake wouldn't comply willingly, then HOA would make sure the car disappeared one way or another. The night was thick with silence, the kind that settled over the neighborhood like a heavy fog, undisturbed except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Inside Jake's house, the dim glow of a single lamp cast long shadows across the living room, illuminating the figure of Edna Carter as she sat in her recliner, a well-worn quilt draped over her legs. She wasn't asleep. She never truly slept deeply these days. Years in the military had trained her to be hyper-aware of her surroundings, to recognize the subtle shifts in sound, the barely perceptible creak of a floorboard that didn't belong. And then she heard it, a metallic click, faint but distinct, coming from the direction of the garage. Edna's eyes snapped open, her senses sharpening instantly. She didn't move, didn't startle, just listened. A few seconds later, another sound. This time, the unmistakable scrape of metal against metal, as if someone were fumbling with a lock. Her grip tightened around the armrest. Someone was trying to break into the garage. Moving with the quiet precision of someone half her age, Edna slid out of the chair, her bare feet making no sound against the hardwood floor. She didn't turn on any lights. No need to alert whoever was outside that she was aware of them. Instead, she made her way to the hallway closet, reaching into the back where an old Remington 870 shotgun sat nestled between forgotten winter coats. Jake always joked that she kept it more out of habit than necessity, but tonight, it seemed like that habit was about to prove useful. She stepped toward the side window, carefully pushing aside the curtain just enough to get a look outside. There were 3 men standing in the driveway, their silhouettes barely visible under the dim glow of the street lamp. One of them, a stocky man in a khaki HOA polo, was standing near the garage door, pressing something against the handle, probably a lockpicking tool. Another man, taller and leaner, was holding a clipboard, his body language exuding an air of smug authority. But it was the third man that made Edna's blood simmer with quiet rage. Richard Wallace. Even in the low light, she recognized the way he carried himself. Self-important, arrogant, a man who thought he was untouchable. She watched as he gestured toward the garage with an impatient flick of his wrist, speaking in hushed tones. The taller man nodded and reached into his back pocket, pulling out what looked like a folded piece of paper. Even from this distance, Edna could make out the bold, official-looking stamp at the top. Probably some fake document they'd conjured up, something that would let them pretend they had the legal right to seize Jake's car. A muscle in her jaw tightened. So that was their plan. They weren't just here to vandalize or send a warning. They were here to take the car, to steal it under the guise of enforcement. They had even brought a tow truck, which was parked a few houses down, its engine idling low, waiting for the signal. The audacity. Edna inhaled slowly, steadying herself. These men thought they could waltz onto private property, take what they wanted, and walk away without consequences. They thought no one would stand up to them. They were about to learn how wrong they were. She moved swiftly toward the garage entrance inside the house, shotgun in hand, heart hammering not with fear but with a calm, simmering fury. When she reached the door that connected the garage to the house, she pressed her ear against it. The lock rattled again and then a faint click. They were inside. Without hesitation, Edna threw the door open and cocked the shotgun, the unmistakable SHHKE slicing through the air like a knife. The reaction was instant. The man in the polo shirt froze mid-step, his eyes going wide as he turned to face her, hands instinctively shooting up. The taller man with the clipboard stumbled back, knocking over a stack of Jake's toolboxes, sending wrenches and screws clattering across the concrete floor. But it was Richard Wallace who looked the most shocked, his face draining of color as he locked eyes with Edna. "What in the holy hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice like steel. Richard swallowed hard. "Mrs. Carter, there's no need for violence, Don't you dare, Mrs. Carter, me, boy," she snapped, stepping forward just enough to make them all shift nervously. "You want to explain why you and your little HOA lackeys are breaking into my grandson's garage at," she glanced at the clock on the wall, 1:30 in the goddamn morning? The stocky man, still holding the lock-picking tool, opened his mouth to protest, but before he could utter a single excuse, Edna raised the shotgun slightly, aiming it just past his shoulder. Not a direct threat, just enough to remind them she wasn't bluffing. Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. This is a legal HOA enforcement action," he stammered, lifting the clipboard as if it were a shield. "Mr. Carter's vehicle is in violation of the community's regulations, and under HOA bylaws, we have the right to remove it." Edna snorted. "You have the right to remove your ass from this garage before I decide to test how fast you can run." The men exchanged nervous glances. The tow truck driver outside honked the horn twice, clearly growing impatient. "Look," Richard tried again, his tone almost pleading now. "Let's be reasonable. This doesn't have to escalate. If you just let us." Edna took one deliberate step forward. "You take one more breath about removing my grandson's car, and I promise you, Richard, the only thing getting removed tonight is your dignity when you run screaming from my property." Silence. Then, as if a switch flipped, the men suddenly scrambled into motion. The lockpicker shoved his tools back into his pocket, the clipboard guy nearly tripped over his own feet trying to back away, and Richard, sweating through his neatly pressed polo, held up his hands in a pathetic show of surrender. "Fine," he muttered through clenched teeth, glaring at her. "Fine. We're leaving." "You're damn right you are," Edna said. "And if I ever catch you or your goons sniffing around this house again, I won't be so friendly next time." The men rushed out, practically tripping over themselves as they scurried down the driveway. The tow truck lurched forward and disappeared into the night, leaving only the distant hum of its engine as it sped away. Edna exhaled slowly, lowering the shotgun. Then, shaking her head, she muttered under her breath, "Bunch of damn fools." The air inside the garage was thick with tension, the kind that gripped the lungs and made every breath feel like an effort. Richard Wallace, usually a man who carried himself with smug self-importance, now stood frozen like a deer caught in headlights. His lips parted slightly as if he wanted to protest, to throw out some half-baked excuse or legal jargon that might save him, but no words came. Instead, his eyes darted toward the open garage door, calculating an escape route. But Edna Carter saw everything. She had spent years reading people, soldiers in the barracks, officers in high command, even the occasional enemy across battle lines. Fear had a certain scent, a subtle shift in body language, and right now Richard reeked of it. The two men who had accompanied him, one still clutching his clipboard like a security blanket, the other standing stiff as a board, weren't much better. The shotgun in Edna's hands wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. A message that these men had made a grave mistake. With calm, deliberate steps, she walked deeper into the garage, letting the cold steel of her barrel tap lightly against her palm. Lockpicking, trespassing, attempted grand theft auto, she listed off, her voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone who had seen real criminals before. Not the brightest move, Richard. Richard swallowed hard. "Look, Mrs. Carter. It's Colonel Carter." The correction sliced through his excuse like a knife. The color drained from Richard's face. His mouth opened, then closed, as if trying to process that this wasn't just some sweet old lady guarding her grandson's car, this was a trained military officer who had dealt with far worse than petty HOA tyrants. The other men took a step back, their previous arrogance dissolving into nervous glances. "You're making a mistake," Richard tried again, his voice trembling despite his attempt at bravado. "This is just an enforcement action. The HOA has rights and you broke into my grandson's garage," Edna finished for him, her grip tightening slightly on the shotgun. "You didn't knock. You didn't file a proper claim. You didn't even have the courtesy to leave a notice. You came in the middle of the night like common thieves." Richard's breath hitched. We have documentation." Edna tilted her head, her expression dark with amusement. "Oh, you mean that piece of paper your lackey there has been clutching like a damned life vest?" She nodded toward the man with the clipboard. "Go on, let me see it." The man hesitated, fingers trembling as he fumbled with the document before holding it out like an offering. Edna snatched it from his grip, scanning the text in seconds. Then she laughed. It wasn't a pleasant laugh, it was sharp, almost pitying, the kind of laugh that made Richard's stomach churn. "This isn't even a real court order," she said, shaking the paper. "This is a fabricated enforcement letter that you typed up on your little HOA letterhead, hoping no one would notice." "And what's this?" She squinted at the bottom of the page. "A fake judge's signature?" "Oh, Richard. You really think a woman who spent decades in the military wouldn't recognize a forged government document?" The clipboard man visibly winced. The stocky man in the HOA polo looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. Richard, however, had gone completely still. "You're gonna listen real carefully," Edna continued, her voice low and commanding. "You and your little cronies are going to walk out of here, get into your cars, and you're going to forget this ever happened. Because if you don't, if you so much as step foot on this property again, I'll make damn sure the real authorities know about this little stunt of yours." She took a slow step forward and Richard actually flinched. "Or..." She let the word hang in the air, heavy with unspoken consequence. "You can try explaining to the police why there are security cameras recording every second of this break-in." Richard's head snapped up. "What?" Edna pointed at the ceiling corner where, nestled neatly between the garage lights, a small but very real security camera blinked red. Richard's jaw tightened. He knew he had lost. They all did. The clipboard man was the first to crack. "We should go," he muttered, already backing toward the door. The stocky man nodded so quickly he looked like a bobblehead. "Yeah. This was a mistake." Edna didn't lower the shotgun until all three men stumbled out of the garage, practically tripping over themselves in their rush to escape. The night swallowed them up, their hurried footsteps echoing down the driveway. Moments later, the distant roar of an engine starting and tires screeching against asphalt signaled their frantic departure. Only then did Edna exhale, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. She turned, glancing at the security camera with a small smirk. Jake was going to love this footage. By the time Jake pulled into the driveway, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars had already painted the street in chaotic streaks of color. His pulse quickened as he stepped out, the crisp night air biting at his skin while he took in the surreal sight before him, Richard Wallace, still in his ridiculous HOA polo, standing stiffly next to an officer, his face pale and tight with barely concealed rage. His two accomplices were nowhere to be seen, most likely having fled the moment things turned sour. Jake's eyes darted to his grandmother, standing tall despite her age, arms crossed, a glimmer of satisfaction dancing in her gaze. Even without saying a word, he knew. She had won. One of the officers, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, turned toward Jake. "You the owner of the property?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, and I'm guessing you're here because of what these clowns pulled?" He gestured toward Richard, whose jaw clenched so hard it looked like it might snap. The officer exchanged a glance with her partner before looking back at Jake. "Your security system recorded everything. Mr. Wallace here and his associates unlawfully entered your garage, and judging by the footage, they were in the process of attempting to seize your vehicle under completely fabricated pretenses." Jake exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "So, what happens now?" "Well," the officer said, flipping through a small notepad, "breaking and entering is already a serious offense, but considering Mr. Wallace used his position in the HOA to try and justify it, we might be looking at fraudulent misrepresentation, illegal seizure of property, and possibly conspiracy to commit theft." Richard's composure cracked. "Now hold on a damn minute." The officer barely looked at him. "Sir, I'd advise you to be quiet before you add obstruction of justice to that list." Jake fought the urge to laugh at the sheer absurdity of it all. Just hours ago, Richard had walked onto his property with the confidence of a king about to claim his land, and now he was standing there, squirming under the weight of his own arrogance. "Are we pressing charges?" The officer's question was directed at him, but before Jake could respond, his grandmother stepped forward. "Absolutely," Edna said, her voice calm, unwavering. "Men like him think they can bully people into submission. That ends tonight." Richard let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Oh, please. You think this is over? The HOA? You mean the HOA that's about to be investigated for fraud, harassment, and illegal property seizures?" Edna cut in smoothly, tilting her head. "Yeah, I think they'll be a little too busy to save your sorry ass." Richard visibly swallowed, his bluster fading into something more fragile, more desperate. The officers didn't give him another chance to argue. In the next breath, he was being escorted toward the waiting police car, the metallic click of handcuffs a satisfying punctuation to the night's events. Jake turned to his grandmother. "You seriously got all that on camera?" She gave him a knowing smile. "Of course I did. What kind of amateur do you take me for?" Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a damn legend, you know that?" Edna merely shrugged, but the sparkle in her eye said she didn't mind the title one bit. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip about what had happened. News spread fast how Richard Wallace, the self-proclaimed king of the HOA, had been caught red-handed trying to steal a resident's car under false pretenses. People whispered about the police investigation, the potential lawsuits, and the very real possibility that the HOA itself might be dissolved entirely. Neighbors who had once cowered under the HOA's rules suddenly found their voices. Complaints flooded city offices. People started questioning the legality of the outrageous fees they had been forced to pay, the unnecessary restrictions, the bullying tactics the board had used for years. Everything Richard had built was crumbling. And Edna Carter? She became a local legend. People would tip their hats when they saw her at the grocery store. Some even brought her homemade pies as a token of gratitude. Jake had never seen so many people suddenly willing to stand up for themselves, and all because one old woman had refused to be intimidated. One afternoon, as Jake was washing his car in the driveway, a middle-aged man from 3 houses down walked up with a grin. "Heard what happened," the man said, nodding toward the garage. "Damn good job. That HOA's been a pain in the ass for years." Jake smirked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah, well, I can't take the credit. That was all my grandma." The man chuckled. "Then you tell that badass lady we all owe her a drink." Jake glanced toward the house where Edna sat on the porch enjoying her iced tea like she hadn't just single-handedly taken down an entire corrupt HOA. He grinned. "Oh, she knows. This story is proof that standing your ground against bullies is always worth it." Richard thought he was untouchable, that his power would protect him, but in the end, he was nothing more than a coward hiding behind fake authority. And thanks to Edna, justice was served. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insane HOA tales. Who knows? Maybe next time it'll be your crazy neighbor making headlines.